In times of trauma and adversity, we must create space for connection by sharing a story of hope. Welcome to Humans of Hope, Inspiring Stories, hosted by Kerry Atherton. This podcast shares inspiring stories of individuals who have faced significant challenges and emerged stronger, offering hope and resilience to listeners all over the world. Join Kerry, the founder of Stories of Hope Worldwide, every week to hear these remarkable journeys and find the strength to overcome your adversity. Now, let's listen in to this week's conversation.
Welcome to another episode. I'm Kerry Atherton and I'm your host, and today's guest is Michelle McFadyen. In 2015, tragedy struck Michelle's life when she was on a journey to Mount Everest base camp and the Nepal earthquake struck. She became part of an unfolding tragedy where, sadly, 9,000 people were killed. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks, Kerry. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I'm just absolutely fascinated by your story. I just want to ask you firstly, when I said that, give you that introduction, what thoughts and feelings arose for you when I was reading that out?
Thanks, Kerry. When I hear other people talk about my experience in Nepal, it actually feels like that person's speaking about somebody else. I listen to it and I think, oh, wow, that must have been tough. And then I reflect and realize that it was actually me that had that experience.
Right. So what led you to be an adventurer?
Oh, wow. So I think it started back in Borneo in like 2009. I climbed a mountain called Mount Kinabalu with my son, who was 13, and I got the bug, so to speak. I went on then to trek the Kokoda Trail in Papua New Guinea in 2011, and then I went on to become a guide on the Kokoda Trail in Papua New Guinea. So I walked that just about every year for the 10 years following that. In the middle of all of that, 2014, I went to Africa and climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. So that's the highest freestanding mountain in the world. And then in 2015, I went to Nepal, which is a place I'd always wanted to go to. And I set off to climb to Everest Base Camp.
Wow. People like you absolutely fascinate me. To be able to do something like that, I think like the scariest thing I've ever done is a bit of snorkeling in Queensland. Turtles and big fish.
You should see me when I'm snorkeling. If the slightest thing touches my leg, I'm out of there. So I think it's horses for courses. But, it was a build-up as well. So lots of training. I didn't just go and climb Mount Kilimanjaro or Everest Base Camp for that matter. There was a lot of training. A lot of work goes in. You put your pack on and you spend the weekends walking mostly. And, the mental preparation is just as important as the physical preparation. And I found that particularly as a guide on the Kokoda track. Now, that's one of the hardest walks in the world.
Yeah.
And it's, it's a difficult, often the most difficult thing people have done. So being a guide on that journey with people has been really eye-opening for me as well.
What was the most eye-opening thing about that journey?
The Kokoda journey. Yeah, look, when I first did it as a trekker, the most eye-opening thing, or the thing that I was least prepared for, wasn't the mental toughness that you need to get through Groundhog Day 9 days in a row. It wasn't the physical training. I'd done all of that. It was actually the emotional journey. So I learned a lot more about the war, the Second World War, particularly the Kokoda campaign between the Aussies and the Japanese before I went. And so being there on the same track that was used for that battle that went forward and backwards, for a long period of time, and sitting in places where history was made and stories of soldiers were told to me. That emotional part of the journey was what surprised me. I wasn't ready for that. I found the journey really emotional. And I'd say that's, I've taken hundreds of people as a guide now, and I would say that's the most common thing I see as well. People train for it, they mentally prepare for it, but they are absolutely not ready for the emotional journey.
Yeah, of just the mass loss of life that happened there and suffering. As we talk today, who is your story for?
Oh, I think it's for anyone that can take something from it and use that in their life to make themselves a better person. Yeah. Fundamentally, it's for me. All my stories are for me, but anyone that's listening, I just hope that they can take something from my story. And I actually think storytelling is really important. And, my friends and I have been talking a lot about AI lately with ChatGPT and all of these things. And one thing that those pieces of technology will never be able to do is tell our personal stories. And I think there's so much impact and value to hearing someone's personal story, because it really does make you realise that, well, if they can do that, then I can do that.
Oh, 100%. And something that has been life-saving to me, reading stories of human resilience and knowing, you know, as you said, that if it can happen for them, I can have, you know, the miracle as well. I can have the healing as well.
Absolutely.
So you've been through trauma that nobody could understand unless they've been and experienced the kind of trauma you've been through. Are you out of that trauma yet?
Yeah, I think it's going to be there for me forever. It's a part of my experience, and therefore it's a part of who I am. But certainly I did a lot of work with a psychologist for a 5-year period following the earthquake. Once I hadn't realised initially that I needed support, but once I realised I needed support, 5 years, and a lot of writing about it, journaling, some good friends to talk through it with, but mainly, you know, seeking professional support. And that was the first time I'd ever seen a psychologist. But yeah, once I realised I needed support, it was the key, I suppose, to help me work through and process the trauma. And, I was diagnosed with PTSD, not surprisingly. I'd like to think that I don't actually have that anymore. There's, I suppose, a helicopter goes by and that still does send shivers down my spine, but it doesn't stop me from doing what I was doing, which is what I used to do.
So trigger, but you're aware of the trigger today, and that's something that's so important, isn't it, in healing of trauma?
Absolutely.
Aware of our triggers and having some kind of plan or thought process in place to combat that.
Yeah.
Before we go back to that day, if you feel like you can go back to that day and talk about it, because I know our viewers would be liking to hear about that. This is a very important thing, because a lot of people that do need help don't realise that they need help, and you didn't realise in the beginning either. So was it a couple of years after the event that you sought help? And what were the signs for you that you needed help in realising that?
Yeah, look, for me, it was a couple of months after I got back from Nepal. And I'm absolutely happy to tell the story as well. But I've been back a couple of months and I went straight back to work. I could recognise that I had a bit of survivor guilt. You know, there was 9,000 people, as you said in the intro, that were killed, 500,000 people homeless. And, you know, I came back thinking, who am I to have survived when so many people didn't, and all of that sort of stuff that we think about when we're going through survivor guilt. So I went back to work straight away, and it was a couple of months after that that I realised I needed support. And it hit me like a bus. I must have had, I'm sure over those 3 months, there would have been taps on my shoulder, you know, you need help, but I ignored them all or didn't recognise them. But yeah, I had I think what we put it down to is an anxiety attack. I'd never had one before. There wasn't a particular trigger. I was doing some work, talking to a colleague at the time, and went into a full-blown anxiety attack. And all I remember, I certainly didn't pass out, but what I remember is waking up on the floor of my office with 2 paramedics and being taken to the hospital, and all the tests were done through the night to have the doctor tell me that they couldn't find anything physically wrong with me and had I been through anything stressful lately. And I even then said, no, I don't think so. And my husband at the time was with me, and he looked at the doctor and said, well, she was in a really bad earthquake just a few months ago. And the doctor said, well, that might do it. And so that was actually the impetus for me to actually recognise that what I'd been through did have an impact on me, and it was okay that it had an impact on me, and go and see a psychologist. So it took me 3 to find the psychologist that would work for me over a period of a few months.
That is the case for many people, and give up after the first one. But keep searching for the right one is the message.
Absolutely, it is a message. You know, my first psychologist was a lovely lady who spent a lot of my sessions with me lying on the floor at her request doing some mindfulness. Now, I've been a meditator for 10 years, like full on committed every day. So I've meditated for a decade, and I knew that wasn't what I needed, but I also knew that by doing what she wanted, I didn't have to dig into my sore spots. And so I just went along with it. But after 6 visits, I realised that hadn't actually supported me. The second person and the second psychologist, I just weren't a fit. And so I only saw him once or twice. But my third one, we're absolutely a fit. And I would encourage people, don't give up. Don't give up.
Oh, that's great. So can you take us back to the day that we're talking about?
So it was Anzac Day, actually, 2015. And the group that I was with, we had already made it to Everest Base Camp. And so we'd done that the day before. We were on our way back down the mountain. So we were still at well over 4,000 metres. And we had our Anzac Day dawn service at a place called Bukla, which is a place on Everest Base Camp, Everest on the road to, the track to Everest Base Camp, where there are a lot of monuments to fallen trekkers and Sherpas. So it's already a very somber, place. And our guides and porters had built us a chorten, which is a rock, sort of a series of rocks put together, quite a big one for us to conduct our Anzac Day service. We had some Kiwis with us. We had a lady from Turkey with us, and we had our flags, and we did the whole service with the last post and everything. And it was for the first time on our whole trip. So this is about day 8 or 9, I think. It was snowing, and we'd had perfect weather up until that point. So we had come out in the snow at dawn. We'd done the dawn service. We'd had a swig of rum, as we do here in Australia, to recognise or to celebrate Anzac Day. And we were walking down from there. So it was about, it was 11:56 a.m. exactly. And we were about 4,006 metres above sea level, just coming into a village where we were going to have lunch. And I was talking to Wanda, who was one of our guides, and him and I were just having a conversation about what we'd eat when we got back to Kathmandu, because the food on the track is fairly basic. And then everything just went really quiet. Like, there were birds and there were donkeys and there were noises, but everything went really quiet. And we both just stopped, and we were on a fairly steep hillside with a track cut into it. So we were looking out to the other side of the Himalayas. So, the vista was amazing. And nothing was moving, but it was very quiet. And then I noticed just some rocks, some tiny little stones falling on the hillside beside me. And I was looking at those, then the ground started to shake. And so my understanding is that the mountains moved a metre, they swayed a metre either side. But when I looked up at the Himalayas, they looked like palm trees swaying in the winds. This massive mountain range with a number of peaks over 8,000 metres, and they actually looked like they were swaying. Now, I was moving and they were moving. And then I remember Wanda, my guide, just yelling, "Run, run." And so I started running. There was a little flatter area that wasn't so steep, just a little further ahead, and that's what we were aiming toward. But as we were running, because the mountain was moving a metre either side, we were kind of almost like thunderbirds. We would lift our foot up, and when we went to put it down, what was there before wasn't there. So we were either putting it down into the air, or onto the hillside. But eventually got up onto the flat area and everything stopped shaking, except me. I was still shaking. And our main guide came back down from the tea house, which was just a little further on. Half our group were in the tea house waiting for lunch, and the other half, which I was in, were still on the track. And he came back, and he's been in the mountains as a Sherpa, and he's been in the mountains for a long, long time. I said, "What was that?" Was that an avalanche? Because I didn't really understand what it was. Because as we were running, actually, Wanda yelled to me, "Look up," because I was looking down to see where my feet were going. But above us were boulders just, coming down the mountain. And so we had to be really careful we weren't in the path of those as we were running to get to some flatter areas. And our lead guide said to me, "That was an earthquake." And he said it's hit down near Kathmandu, which he was looking toward. And he said, "And it's a big one." Now, at the time, the first thing that went into my brain was, oh my gosh, he has his wife and twin baby daughters in Kathmandu.
Oh.
Now, from that point on, we didn't have any communication for 24 hours. In fact, the whole communication system in Nepal went out. And so there was no in or out communication. And anyway, we got to the tea house. The minute we got into the tea house, very shaken, as you can imagine, everyone was, we started to experience the aftershocks. And so we were running back outside again, and once again looking at these boulders, the size of cars, coming down and dodging those.
Size of cars.
Yeah. And we moved from there. We really, again, didn't have any understanding of the seriousness of what had just happened. The little village we were in was okay. A few of the tea houses had structural damage, but really we were okay. And of course, not having any understanding of the devastation that had just occurred further away from us down in Kathmandu. And at the time, we also didn't know what had happened up at Everest Base Camp. So we started walking, and we were walking down. There were still groups coming up because, like us, they'd experienced something similar to us and, were continuing on their trek, unbeknownst to any of us that this was going to be, one of the most devastating things ever happening to this country for a long, long time. And so we made our way down. Now, what we were hearing as we got further down the mountain was that, 100 people had died in Kathmandu. We were devastated, and that some people had died at Everest Base Camp, and we were devastated. And we were hearing figures like, 2 people at base camp, 100 in Kathmandu. And the further we went down just that afternoon, the more news we got about it. And it was 300 people and it was 400 people. And as we know, it turned out to be 9,000 people. And I think there was close to 20 people, I think it was, that were killed at Everest Base Camp because the earthquake actually triggered an avalanche at Everest Base Camp. And there's plenty of footage of that online if anyone wants to have a look at it. But that footage is really scary. Base camp is like a big tent city, and there's between 500 and 700 people camped in base camp at any one time.
Yeah.
And so, and these are the people that are actually waiting to climb to Everest, to the top of Everest proper.
Were you actually, now that you look back, in the safest place?
Well, our trip, we were actually very lucky because our trip, we'd moved ahead a day of our normal schedule because we knew the weather was coming in. Yeah. So we were meant to be actually having our Anzac Day service at 11 a.m. in base camp proper because our guide had contacts in base camp proper. So, there, but for the grace of God, we actually were at 11 a.m. meant to be having our service in base camp, and we would absolutely have been involved in that avalanche, no doubt, if we kept to our schedule. So we kept on walking, and we had no choice. Everyone was a bit stunned. People that we passed as we moved through the villages, we saw more and more devastation. So we saw, death, injury. We saw buildings completely demolished, and we're talking about buildings that are generally stone buildings, not put together with any reinforcement structurally. And they generally don't even have any mortar or grout in between them. So they're very fragile. And we got to Tengboche, which is a fairly famous place, has a big monastery. And we were meant to be staying in Tengboche that night. Now, none of us were equipped to sleep outside because we've been staying in tea houses. So we found that a tea house in Tengboche that was, the top 2 stories had pretty much collapsed, but the bottom story was still okay. And we all went in and tried to get some rest in the kitchen area of that tea house. The monastery, unfortunately, had been significantly damaged, and the mist had come in and it was snowing again. So it was a difficult evening. We were having aftershocks about every 30 minutes and having to run out of the bottom story of this tea house into the, sub-zero temperature, snowing weather. But in any case, we made it through the night, and then we put our packs on and we walked down to Namche Bazaar, which is the biggest village on the walk, some 3,500 metres above sea level, and managed to get into there just as we were arriving into Namche Bazaar, about 500 metres from the top of that. It's built in a bowl, like in a valley. So about 500 metres from the top of Namche Bazaar, the second earthquake hit, and that was only just under on the Richter scale, the 7.8 that the first one was recorded at.
Whoa, no.
So, yeah, that was also really frightening. By that stage, we had a bit of awareness about it. So we knew to look up, not down. We knew probably what was a bit safer on the track than what wasn't. And then we managed to get into the top of Namche Bazaar just as the entire community of Namche Bazaar were coming out of the village and up onto this high flat area that exists sort of around the top of the bowl that it's built in, because even the locals weren't prepared to stay down there anymore. And there was a fair bit of devastation in terms of the buildings. So that became like a refugee camp. We didn't have a tent. We didn't have anything like many people, and it was going to be really cold overnight. Our guides managed to get a couple of tents, and we all just piled into those. I think there was 14 people in one very small tent, but that's how we had to do it. And he managed to get us some soup and some water. So we're actually quite honoured. I look at this, and there were, all the villagers were coming up, and they were sleeping under tarpaulins. Families with babies. And so it became more and more people came up there. It became like I imagine a refugee camp would become.
Yeah.
No one wanted to go down into the village. And yet, in the midst of all of that, there was some beautiful acts of kindness. There was a red tent, and all of a sudden everyone started to smell the beautiful smell of dal bhat, which is the staple meal over there. And, this steam and smoke coming from this little red tent that was set up in the midst of all the other tents. And And I went over and had a look inside, and here's this lovely Nepali couple of kids on the ground, and they had brought up all the food that they could carry, and they were making dal bhat and giving it away.
Oh,
I know.
Isn't it incredible in the midst of suffering, how just the tiniest thing can just bring gratitude to you, things that people would just take for granted every day.
Yeah, and they'd lost everything. I talked to them. They'd lost their home, which was also their business, because almost everyone has a shop at the bottom of their home. They'd lost that. It had been demolished, and yet they grabbed what they could, came up to the top, and dal bhat for particularly all of the tourists. What I found with the Nepali people in the earthquake was their biggest concern was for us foreigners.
Oh, gosh.
That's who they are.
Wow.
So moving on. So from there,
thank you for sharing that, because that's something really special.
Yeah, it is really special. It's a good memory.
Yeah,
it's a good memory. So we moved from there. We got up in the morning. Obviously, not much sleep was had, and it was very cold.
What was the temperature, Michelle?
I wouldn't know, but it was below zero.
Wow.
Yeah, overnight. I wouldn't know what it got to. So from Nemche Bazaar, would normally continue walking down to Lukla. Now, Lukla's the airport where you fly in to start and where you fly out of at the end of your treks. And Lukla is the world's most dangerous airport. So you might have seen some, videos of that. It's built into the side of a mountain, and it's notorious and actually known as the world's most dangerous airport. So we had to get to Lukla to have any chance of getting out of there. And the walk, apparently, our guides found out some information that the walk from Namche, where we were, down to Lukla was fraught with danger. There were heaps of landslides. It was quite steep, so it was tenuous in terms of more landslips, particularly with the continued aftershocks. So we were extremely lucky in that our guides were able to get a helicopter that came and so we went up to the helipad, which is a generous word for what it was. It was a bunch of rocks on the side of a mountain, and a helicopter would land, and some of us would jump into it with our bags. I know I was on the first helicopter. We jumped in and I was in the front. Now, these helicopters are made for sightseeing, so the bottom of it is glass or perspex, it's so I could see everything. And as the chopper started to take off, he realised he was too heavy, because it took off and it banged down again, and it took off and it banged down. And then they came and opened up the doors and took all our bags out and shut the doors again. And we took off, but he had to sort of hop his way over to the edge of the mountain and then fall off. And I actually thought, well, the earthquake didn't get me, but this will. And then he just started the mountain range. It's only a 7-minute helicopter ride, but it was 7 minutes of the most scariest time of my life. Anyway, we landed in Lukla, and as I got off the chopper, I've got my backpack on my front, and I've ducked down as I come in underneath to get away from the wind, and I'm sort of running out because everything was rushed. The helicopter had to get back and pick up more people, and I've tripped over what I thought was just a big bunch of, duffel bags under tarps, and I've tripped into them, and so I've turned around to try and grab my pack and get back out again. I've still got the wind from the helicopter, and I've realised that I wasn't lying on bags. I was lying on bodies that had been transported back from Everest Base Camp.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So I managed to jump myself out of that and continue off and wait for the rest of our crew to come on the helicopter. And so Lukla was becoming really, really busy. It's a type of airport whereby about, if you're lucky, 2 in the afternoon, planes will stop, because the minute the weather comes in, they can't land or take off anymore because it's all on site. And it's only a very small airstrip, and the planes that land are only very small. So there were already a lot of people trying to get out and back to Kathmandu. By that stage, the Australian Embassy had contacted us, and our insurers had contacted us. They knew where we were, but in the embassy's words, until you can get yourself to Kathmandu, we really can't do anything for you. So we knew we were on our own. We did have somewhere to stay that wasn't too badly damaged, and so we spent, it might have been 4 or 5 nights. Every day we would get up and we would go to the airport. We had a scheduled flight, but that didn't make any difference. We would go to the airport, and things were becoming unsanitary. So the toilets weren't keeping up, and they're not the most sanitary toilets at the best of times. People were sleeping in the streets. That's also a generous word, in the lanes of Lukla. Food was becoming an issue, and people were literally just mobbing planes as they arrived and getting on them. So there was no ticketing system, didn't matter anymore. One of the things that was really sad was what we trekked side by side with a group of men, predominantly from New Zealand, who had brought a school reunion. And we became really good friends with them. Now, they stuck to their original itinerary and they were actually up at Everest Base Camp when the avalanche hit. And unfortunately, one of their trekkers was killed. And sadly, they managed to get his body down to Lukla, but there was just no way that they would be able to, with everything else that was going on, get his body, taken back to Kathmandu and then the repatriation back to Australia. So with the permission of his family, the local Buddhists in Lukla actually conducted a ceremony, and they walked his body all the way through town and they took it to a place up on the mountain where they do cremations, and they cremated his body, and that enabled that group of trekkers. In fact, they got on a plane before me, but I was quite happy to see that happen. And they had Greg's remains with them that they could take home. So,
wow, God.
Yeah. Beautiful gesture by the local Buddhist people in such a time. But so we every day we would get up and we would go and wait for our plane, and we wouldn't get one, and then the weather would come in, and then we'd go back and we'd do the same thing. And on what turned out to be our last day, our guides, our local guides and our Aussie guide, who happened to be ex-SAS, he said, right, we're getting on a plane today. And so we managed to get ourselves through a throng of a couple of hundred people toward the front. And the next plane that landed, I think they had arranged with some of the local people to create an opportunity for us to get out on the tarmac, which we did. And we all got onto this plane, effectively hijacking it. And because the planes were literally coming in, turning around, opening their doors, people were running on them, doors were closing, and they were flying off again to clear the runway. And so we all got on the plane, and I remember I was right up the front. You can see the pilot, they're very small planes, and the pilot would come down the runway, would taken off, and everyone just breathed this huge sigh of relief. We were one step closer to Kathmandu and then one step closer to home. And the flight to Kathmandu is about 30 minutes. But as we were flying, I was sort of thinking, this doesn't feel like the same way that we came. And then once we'd been on the plane for about an hour, we realised that we probably weren't going to Kathmandu. So unfortunately, we hijacked the wrong plane, and we were on our way to Viratnagar, which is I'm getting my directions right, it was in the southeastern side of Nepal, right down on the border with India. And so our plane lands in Viratnagar. We're at sea level, and we've come from somewhere that was relatively cool. So we're all in our puffy jackets, and we had to, move into this big concrete airport terminal in the middle of really nowhere, and then get onto the embassy and try and work out how on earth we would get a flight from there back to Kathmandu. We managed to that night.
Yeah.
And we knew that the rush was, we knew that the Australian government had sent two, I don't know what they're called, maybe C-17s or something, but two huge planes, aircraft that have the back comes down and everyone runs onto the back, and that cargo planes, I think, that they take a lot of
movies.
Yeah, like that. And we knew Australia had sent two of those to Kathmandu to repatriate Australians and take them back to Bangkok. And we knew one plane had already landed and taken off, and the other plane was getting ready to go. And so we had, our aim was to try to get back to Kathmandu in time to get on that second Air Force plane. So it was devastating as we did eventually land in Kathmandu at about midnight to watch as we're taxiing down the runway, to watch the other Australian plane, the Air Force defence plane, actually take off right in front of our eyes. So we missed it by this much.
Wow.
But managed to get ourselves off that plane at midnight into the Australian Embassy, which was amazing. The ambassador there was really good. There was already about 150 Australians and New Zealanders. And the building, of course, had been really badly damaged, but the lawns, the grounds were okay. And so they just had big marquees set up, and everyone was kind of sleeping in those on, sleeping bags and mats that they had provided. They had Defence Force rations there for us, which was really nice. So we got to eat something and we got to have some sleep, and we got to wake up in the morning to find our insurance company had sent over a number of representatives, including trauma nurses, a doctor, a psychologist, which was great. That night, nearly again at midnight, we were on a chartered plane. The insurance company actually chartered Air Asia jet, I think it was, and took about 150 Australians home. So we flew to Kuala Lumpur that next night with mixed feelings for me. I mean, I knew the best thing for us to do as tourists in that country right then was to get out.
Yeah.
For the sake of Nepal, because they just didn't need to be worrying about us as well. But it was hard, leaving them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why was it hard leaving them?
Because there was so much to be done. There was so much devastation.
Yeah.
And you knew you could be helpful by getting in and mucking in and helping. And the Nepali government were really saying, just if you're a tourist and you can get out, please get out.
Yeah.
The next day back to Sydney and back to home.
Wow.
Yeah.
So just so much to take in. So much to process, even listening, but going through it would just be, there would be so much to unpack and so much to unravel. From the minute that the earthquake hit, because it sounds to us listening, it's like in slow motion, and probably for you going through it too when you think back. But how long was it from the time the earthquake hit to the time that you actually got to a safe spot?
So when the earthquake hit, it probably shook for only 30, 40, 50 seconds.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. But then the aftershocks continued for 24 hours, and then the next earthquake hit, and then aftershocks continued. Aftershocks were still happening when we were in Kathmandu. And because we were sleeping on the ground, actually on the earth, you could sense the aftershocks there, pretty significantly, even then back in Kathmandu.
So how many days was it then from the day of the earthquake?
I think it was about 7 to the day of the earthquake until we got into Kathmandu and then on that plane back to Kuala Lumpur. Yeah, about 7 days. And, it's, each day I saw things that people shouldn't have to see. And there's a lot of Hindu people in, and Buddhists, but a lot of Hindu people in Nepal and in Kathmandu particularly. Like, and when we got back there, one of the things that's really stuck with me is that in the Hindu religion, the person who's passed away must be cremated within a certain period of time for reincarnation to be able to occur. And because the Ghats, which is the place along the river where all of those cremations, generally speaking, are taking place, because that was so backed up and so busy, people were resorting to burning their loved ones in their front, on their front footpath, because they needed to have that cremation done. And so you were walking and driving past, really intimate grieving ceremonies, and all around them is devastation. All around everyone is devastation. So the things we had to see and do just to get through, by day 7, seeing that, I wouldn't say it was normal, but it was absolutely par for the course given what we had already seen in the 6 days before that. So it's amazing what we can do as human beings to get through something when we just know we've got to get through something.
Yeah. Getting through the unimaginable.
But the good news is I have been drawn to go back to Nepal ever since that earthquake, but the time was never right for me. I didn't feel ready until just last year. So in October last year, my partner and I went over and we did another trek, not Everest Base Camp. I didn't want to trek in the same area. So I trekked in a completely different area on a really non-touristy, lesser-known trek called PK Peak. And we did that trek. We spent a few days in Kathmandu. We spent a few days down in Pokhara, which I hadn't gotten to last time. And I got to catch up, actually, and have coffee with both my guide.
Did you?
Yeah, the one that yelled, run, run, Wanda. And he's doing really well. And his journey is a really interesting journey as well. He, after the earthquake, he turned to drugs and alcohol. And he spent a number of years in that kind of place, and in the end ended up in rehab and coming out, and he now has his own little company called Walk with Wanda, and he leads trips and promotes AA and promotes recovery on his walks. And he's actually, since his recovery, he's actually climbed Everest proper.
I'd love to meet Michelle.
Yeah, I can put you in contact with him.
Well, that would be so great. Was he the one whose wife and children?
No, that was Sumit, another one of the lead guides. So,
was his wife and children okay?
Yes, they were. Yes, thankfully.
That's the end to the story.
So I had a drink. I got to catch up and have a drink with Wanda, and it was just so beautiful. And reconnecting with people who were there with you, you don't need any words.
Yeah.
Whereas, when you're trying to tell somebody else about it, there's a narrative. But when I'm with him, we just look at each other. It's like, yeah. And also another fellow named Barrett, who was a young porter actually on our trip, and he was carrying some of the bags for our group. And I'd love to catch up with him and have a coffee. And he's also, as most of the young people over there do, that he started his own trekking company as well. So that was really special for me to be able to reconnect with them, to see the country again. Now, I had an earthquake app on my phone, and so I was keeping a track on that. And it wasn't until the last few days of this trip last year that a number of earthquakes were starting to happen around Nepal. There was one out to the west that had killed 6 people, and it started to become, I started to become quite anxious toward the end of that trip.
Yeah.
And so I was not unhappy to get on the plane, given the earthquake activity that was occurring.
Yeah.
And that was shortly before, of course, all those earthquakes that have hit in Turkey and a range of other places. So it was cathartic, and I'm really pleased I got to go back and reconnect.
Oh, that's so great. I'm so glad to hear that. As we close up shortly, maybe we might have to do a second interview. There's so much to talk about. With your self-care strategies to get well and recover, obviously you had counselling, gone back and you've done this second trip, which is something that you've gone back. It's exposure therapy, isn't it, Ellie? And revisited that place of devastation. And also your tattoos. They were part of that too, haven't they?
I know that you can see them. So Kerry's seen these in person. But
that's amazing.
I actually got an original tattoo just to, I said, not commemorate. I'm never going to forget it. And it's got the actual, all of the longitude and latitude GPS coordinates of where I was standing when the earthquake hit, and the details, the date, time, the magnitude, and a broken compass. And then I continued it with the Buddha head, because it was the local Buddhas who cremated Greg. It was Anzac Day, so I've got poppies, the Om Mani Padme Hum Tibetan prayer flags, and then I don't know if anyone can see that, but the eyes. This is the phoenix here, and the eyes for me are just seeing things anew and being grateful, I suppose, to be able to see things again. But so self-care, well, I don't know that was self-care, but it's certainly, that's also a cathartic thing for me. Yeah, it's a healing thing. I would say meditation, and I meditated before I went over there, but it's been a really good grounding for me. Really, it was about what I learnt in therapy around recognising my feelings, recognising emotions, and recognising it in my body, coming up with strategies to, I think, just pay some attention to it. What I've been doing my whole life. For example, I gave up smoking when I was 40, and I took up athletics in the little town I lived in because I knew it would keep me fit. 2 years later, I'm competing at the Masters Athletics Championships in Tahiti. So I don't tend to do things I don't tend to do things by half.
No.
But that was part of the issue for me, was that a lot of what I used to do in keeping myself so busy was because I didn't want to face and deal with anything. This is
escapism, isn't it? Like a different form of addiction, but
absolutely. So learning to pay attention to and give space in my life to my feelings and emotions, I think, is probably the most important thing. But I'm a lot less busy since all of that therapy. I make time to read a book. I still have niggling feelings of I should be doing something productive, but I make time to read a book. I make time to go for walks. I still hike quite a bit. I like to go camping. So really, it's just listening to myself and my body and my intuition more than I ever did.
Oh, that's amazing. And in your spare time, you're a mental health first aid trainer.
Yeah. So I do mental health first aid training. When I first went to see a psychologist, I was shit scared. I didn't know what to expect and reluctant. My view was that if you had to see a psychologist, you didn't have your shit together. And so I was admitting I didn't have my shit together by going to see a psychologist. But what I learned in that period of time, and how useful it is, what I've learned about mental illness and mental health, has given me a real passion for working in workplaces, particularly with mental health first aid and mental health awareness and workplace wellbeing stuff.
That's great. And a question that I ask everyone, I've got 2 more quick questions, which are big questions, but you might know just off the top of your head. What's been your greatest light bulb moment?
I think my greatest light bulb moment was lying on the floor of my office with 2 paramedics around me.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be my greatest light bulb moment, because it wasn't so much the earthquake. I mean, absolutely, the earthquake made me rethink a whole lot of things, but it was that moment where I was lying on the floor where I realised that I'm not invincible. that this stuff I need to deal with this stuff, and I can deal with it and I can get through it.
Great. As we finish now, what's your message for the world?
Ooh, I probably have many messages for the world, but maybe one could be whatever you're going through, you can get through it. There are people before you who have gotten through it, and you will get through it, and you'll come across other times in your life where you'll think you can't get through it, but you can. So it's often those things that we think we'll never get through that we come through, and actually we come through. And the advice I would give is when we get through it is to take a moment to look back and try and recognize the gifts that came from the getting through.
I love that. Oh, Michelle, you are a resilient, remarkable, beautiful human. And I'm so glad I met you at the Mental Health First Aid training course.
Thanks, Kerry, likewise.
Thank you so much for sharing your story today.
You're so welcome.
Thank you for listening to Humans of Hope Inspiring Stories with Kerry Atherton. If this conversation helped you, please consider sharing the podcast with a friend or leave a rating and review on your podcast player. Thank you to Matthew Bliss for podcast production and consultation, and to Kintsugi Heroes for making this podcast possible. If you'd like to find out more about Kerry Atherton, head to storiesofhope.com.au, where you can purchase her books or find out where her next event is taking place. Check the show notes for links and information about our guest in this episode. And remember, you don't have to walk your path alone.